Okay, we are ready to begin today, so be sure you have a handout. For most of them, it is 2 pages stapled together. There are a few copies on the one thing where it's a double-sided, so don't get both of them. They are identical, but you'll need the handout for all the stuff we're going to be looking at today. Okay, let's open with the word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, as always, we just marvel at your exceeding goodness to us and the bountiful blessings that you provide on a daily basis. We thank you for just the refreshing snow as we awake this morning and look at the side of the mountain. We thank you for your promises, the way you care for your garden, the way you take care of the world, because you created it for your glory, and so help us to see you manifested even in all these things. But of course, most of all, we're thankful for yourself, your godness, what a wonderful God you are. We're thankful that you've been pleased to record for us this love letter from heaven, and so as we try to understand it today and see why it's appropriate for us to study it, that we would be blessed indeed. We thank you that the Holy Spirit works within us, and may we allow Him to do His work, not just while we sit here and try and learn, but every day help us to so submit to Him that we truly would be conformed to the Lord Jesus Christ. So you know the various needs of the KBC family, especially we'd ask for our young people who are out camping, that you will bring them back safely, and trust it's been a refreshing couple of days for them. But bless us here in this hour, we ask for Jesus' sake. Amen. Okay, I've already been questioned concerning 2 timelines on your handout, but I figure I have prepared you adequately so you can handle not 1 but 2. As you know, in our current Adult Sunday School series here, we're dealing with ecclesiology, which is the doctrine of the church. And so as we're doing this, so as we head into our 50th year celebration, you will be a little bit more prepared to know about our KBC history, etc. And so for last week, today, Lord willing, and then next Sunday as well, I'm going to be trying to bring together the past and the present and the future, shall we say, as we think about what God has done in bringing us to this point, and then the challenge it can be for us as we go forward. Last week, and by the way, be sure you do have a handout because you'll need one. Last week we talked about our emphasis being the church's people, and we especially emphasized how God has brought such marvelous people our way throughout our history. The diversity, the kinship, as well as just working together. In other words, fellow workers, as everybody just pulled together and didn't have an agenda of their own, but they simply said, God is at the center, and we want to be sure God is at the center, and we want to be used in whatever way we can for His glory. Now, today I want to emphasize the building, okay? And perhaps your first thought is, wait a minute, Pastor Phil and Pastor Tommy, when they taught on some ecclesiological issues several weeks ago, emphasized the fact that the church is not a building, okay? So I'm here to contradict them and say they didn't know. I'm here to agree and say, of course, the church is not a building. I stressed that last week as well. So you are partially right when you kind of question that. But remember, God's people throughout history have worshiped Him, shall we say, at a place or a building or a facility. And today, the first part is our theological base. We're going to go back and we're going to trace a little bit of that in the Old Testament, where God did appoint a place for the gathering together of His people. And whether it was the tabernacle, the temple, the synagogue, whether it was the house church in the first century, church buildings today, etc., God has ordained for the gathering together of His people. This is not just a freaky thing and we say, hey, why don't we all just come together instead of sitting at home and have our own house church or home church? No, we are supposed to gather together. And so therefore, today that's what we want to talk about, this important place of meeting, if you will, that God has ordained. And of course, as we deal with this, we're not just talking about the exact location on Google Maps or the acreage of the place or the building construction materials and stuff like that. Those things, of course, come into play, but that's not what's most important. What I really want us to see is how God is the one who has directed this, the way He directed the Old Testament Israelites. And as you'll see when we get to our application, how very definitely God worked in our lives in directing, but also the involvement of people. So even as we think of a place, we need to emphasize and see how God used people as He sanctified or as He set apart those places, etc. And hopefully, again, this can be kind of a springboard that as long as the Lord tarries and spares us, we can learn lessons from it to pass along to the next generation. So if 30, 40, 50 years from now, KBC is celebrating another anniversary, those people can look back and say, wow, it is really neat the way those KBCers in 2020s followed the Lord's direction, the way they tried to honor Him and serve Him, and the kind of legacy that they have given us. So, let's start first of all with the theological base. As I told you last week, I'm trying to tie each of these Sunday school lessons in with a major, shall we say, ecclesiological teaching in the Bible, and then bring that home to us as we apply some things. So, the theological base I want to start with today concerns the tabernacle and the temples in the Old Testament. As you know, from the very beginning, God desired to have close communion and fellowship with His people. And to start out with, His people were Adam and Eve, okay? And He had a perfect relationship with them until they blew it, and sin separated them from Him. But as you know, even then, God made a way of approach for them, okay? God didn't just write off humanity and say, this is going to be a long history with nobody to fellowship with other than Himself in the Trinity. No, God wants to fellowship with His people. And so in those early years, even before the tabernacle was established, as God revealed Himself at sacred places to various people, shall we say that was His way of really fellowshipping with them and working with them. But it wasn't until we get to basically the time of the Exodus from Egypt, when Israel exited Egypt, that God said, okay, now we need a specific place. We need, shall we say, a building whereby I can be fellowshipping with you, and this will be the, shall we say, the place of His localized presence. So on the handout at the very top, let's quickly walk through with me that timeline so you get this perspective throughout history, so you can see how God has always been, shall we say, had this as His desire. We start off with the tent back in Exodus 33. And I know generally when we read that, we might think, well, that's just talking about the tent or the tabernacle that it's about to be built. But that's not the case at all. Actually, this was a provisional temporary tent that God had them set up even before the tabernacle. And when you read it in English versions, as I say, it generally you don't realize it is a different one, but I think there are some translations that try and state it in a way so you realize this was going on now before the tabernacle was set up. And then Israel exited Egypt in 1446, as you know. They went down to Mount Sinai, and by the time the tabernacle was built and dedicated, we basically put 1445 as the date. And then we have Solomon's temple, dedicated in 969. Very few references actually to it, actually to the building process. You see those on your sheet. And then, of course, Zerubbabel's temple in 516 BC. You can read about that in Ezra 4-6. And then while Israel was in exile, we have the synagogues. From tradition, from what history seems to present to us, that's when they began. And then we have Herod's temple just prior to the time of Christ and into the time of Christ. Today we have church buildings, started out, of course, as house churches, and now we actually have buildings. And then even future to us is Ezekiel's temple as it's revealed in the last chapters of Ezekiel. So what about just a couple of brief points for each of these? Okay, drop below that line on your handout. And as I said, first of all, the tent, that was a provisional or temporary meeting place where God would go in and meet with Moses, and then He would come out and He would minister to the people. Then with the tabernacle, we find God was giving instructions to them after the Exodus while they were at Mount Sinai. And of course, this was the tabernacle that they carried all the way through the wilderness. This was the tabernacle that for literally hundreds and hundreds of years was the focal point of worship in the Promised Land before the temple was built. And then we have Solomon's temple. This was their first permanent structure. The text tells us, 1 Kings 6:1, it was built in the 480th year after the Exodus. And we're told that that was Solomon's 4th year. So this is a super critical date in Old Testament studies. We know Solomon began reigning in 970. That's even an established liberal date. So his 4th year is 966. If you add 480 years to it, that's how you get the 446 date for the Exodus. Now, it took about 7.5 years to build, so that's why from about 966 to 959, they were building Solomon's temple, and then it was dedicated, and of course, ultimately it was destroyed by the Babylonians on their third offensive into the southern kingdom, 586 BC. Okay, so that was the magnificent Solomon's temple. And then when the first returnees came back from Babylonian captivity, they actually returned in 538 BC, but then they started laying the foundation. They got basically worldly and started simply taking care of their own needs, and at the same time there was external pressure, so they had excuses to say, well, we can't do God's work because of these things. So it wasn't until 520 when the prophets Haggai and Zechariah stirred up God's people to build again, and they completed that in 516 BC. And because Zerubbabel was the major leader, and Jeshua was the high priest, that's why it is called Zerubbabel's temple. This was the temple that was plundered and then desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes, who you remember, according to the book of Daniel, is a forerunner or a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist is going to be like in the last days. This was the temple that he desecrated by offering the swine on the altar, etc. And then the Maccabeus, Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, they're the ones who fought back against him, etc. And then they rededicated the temple 165, 164. And of course, the present-day Jewish holiday or celebration that is based on that event is none other than Hanukkah. And I believe, it wasn't Hanukkah the Jews just celebrated. What was the other famous day they just... Rosh Hashanah, yeah, the head of the new year, and Day of Atonement, and so on. So Hanukkah came about as a result of that temple rededication. But then while the children of Israel, or while the Israelites, the Jews, were in captivity there, they established the synagogues, and the synagogues actually just continued even after they got back in the land, and when they got back in the land, basically wherever there was a population center throughout Palestine, they would have a synagogue. This was a Jewish house of worship, and as it says, first ones established during the Babylonian exile. And then Herod's temple, in about 20 or 19 BC, he began to expand and beautify it. It took him about 10 years of renovating it. But actually, that was just the major part, but his renovation continued for about 46 years. So you remember in the New Testament, in John chapter 2, verse I put on your sheet, where the Jews, when they were talking to Jesus, said, "How are you going to destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Herod's been doing this 46 years and he hasn't completed it." Well, it's referring to the fact that indeed he'd started this around 20 BC, and he'd been working on it well into the time of Jesus' ministry. So this is the temple Jesus attended, and this is the one that when we read the book of Acts and it talks about events happening at the temple, this is the temple called Herod's temple where that occurred. And then, of course, no sooner did they get it renovated and fixed up nice, and Titus and the Romans came through and destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. Okay? And then we started out, the New Testament believers originally started in house churches, and then as things progressed, etc., and more people were saved, eventually it became church buildings, and ultimately we come to Ezekiel's temple to be built in the future. So that's a real big a real big bird's eye view, if you will, a real big picture, a scan of all this. But again, it's important if you can even remember that just as you're reading the Old Testament through every year. So you see God's provision for His people, what He ordained, a place where they would gather together for corporate worship, as we would say. So we have this wonderful picture of God meeting with His people in worship. So let's use our time today in the Old Testament and consider some important, shall we say, theological points that we find as we study the tabernacle, since this was the first permanent dwelling with the Israelites. Now, as we study some of these concepts, it can be difficult and not just to understand what's said, because oftentimes it's fairly terse what is given to us, but probably the biggest stumbling block for people is to simply come along and say, wait a minute, this was so many thousand years ago. I mean, I am an up-to-date, modern, 21st century Christian. What in the world would this have to do with me? You know, no application, so if I've got to read the Bible through in a year, I will speed read it in a minute and a half or so, and then get on to stuff that really matters. Please don't come to me and tell me that's your attitude face to face, okay? But that's oftentimes how we look at things. It's like, well, wait a minute. What's the point here? Well, so on your sheet, I put two key things to keep in mind as we study a lot of this Old Testament stuff that would maybe seem to not be quite as appropriate for us. And the two key words here are form and function. Okay, form and function. First of all, as we study the form, remember, Israel was not just engaging in some rigmarole, some mindless game, religious game, if you will, but this was stuff that God revealed to them that they should do. They didn't just wake up one morning and say, I seem to have an emptiness in my soul. I think I'm going to start some religious motions so I can feel better, like I'm spiritual. And they started doing it, and then they told their grandkids, hey, Gramps wants to be proud of you, so please carry this on in the family tradition. No, not at all. God ordained this stuff, and He said, I want to fellowship with you. I want you to have a relationship with me, and here is the way we will do it. Here is the form, in other words. Now, behind that form, or dare we say growing out of the form, there was a function in the sense that God was trying to teach them important principles. And so when He said, bring these sacrifices, He didn't just say, I want to keep you all on the same level so nobody has more cows than anybody else, so I'm going to require everybody to slaughter X number of cows this year. No. Or He didn't just say, well, I don't want anybody to become a big grain farmer, so everybody can only keep X number of bushels of grain and you've got to give the rest to socialistic purposes. No. All that sacrificial stuff had meaning to it, purpose. He was trying to teach them a principle, a very important thing concerning their walk with Him. Okay, now as we begin to think of this stuff, as I put on your sheet, we need to ask ourselves, well, what would that principle be for today? In other words, as we see the principle God was trying to teach Israel concerning thankfulness, gratitude, concerning sharing, concerning how we approach Him, etc. Okay, we ask ourselves, is that principle still valid today? Are we to be thankful people? Are we supposed to recognize the source of all our blessings? Are we supposed to realize we need God's help because we cannot be rightly related to Him apart from the work that He has done for us, etc., etc.? And then having said yes to the principles, then we can say, okay, what would be an appropriate form for us to express that today? And in many ways, we already do a lot of this stuff. We just don't walk through it in our minds. But in our local assemblies, we really do these things when we make decisions, and that's the way it ought to be, okay? But especially when it comes to some of these more difficult things, I think that's where it's very important, where we just have to sit down and do the brain sweat and really think through it and say, okay, instead of saying this is irrelevant material, we need to say, what was God teaching His people, and what would that be for us today, and then how would we bring it into our Christian lives? So, on the one hand, the tabernacle was actually a very simple structure, originally constructed in the desert. It had to be portable because they had to take it down build it back up, take it down, etc. But it also had to be very, very transportable, because they had to be able to carry it hundreds of miles through the desert, etc. Okay? And so therefore on the one hand it was very simple, but on the other hand it was highly complex, because the tabernacle was indeed more than just a building. So the quote I put on your sheet, the tabernacle was very practical, but everything meant something. There was intentionality behind every material choice and every sculptural choice. The primary concern wasn't occupancy, but telling a narrative and conveying meaning. So in other words, we would say space communicates, and that's why, as the title for our lesson today, I put at the top there, we're not just talking about buildings, but we're talking about a theology of space. So in other words, when a church builds a building, actually they ought to be asking themselves the question, what is our theology of space? And by space I don't mean NASA and where Elon Musk wants to go and all that stuff, okay? I'm talking about a theology of space right here. What are we trying to communicate by the building? What are we trying to communicate by this space where we meet and worship God? And I might, without getting too far afield here, just remind you, think of a mall or think of a store, and when you enter a store, think of the things that are right at the front of the store, because they're trying to communicate something to you, and they're trying to, shall we say, sucker you into buying something. So they know what to put right there by the cash register, so when you check out, you see that extra soft drink or those candy bars or that magazine, and you say, oh yeah, just throw it in there. You didn't plan on buying that when you walked in, but they said, how can we use our space to communicate something and get you to buy more stuff in here? And that's why clothes are put in certain places of a store, so you've got to walk through certain things before you even get to the sale items, etc. It's all calculated, okay? Don't think I'm a conspiracy theorist or something, but that's good business. That's the way it's set up. And so that's what we mean by a theology of space. What are we trying to communicate? What do we want people to think about as soon as they walk in those doors or even drive past on Flint Street? So, let's talk first of all about some names, just very quickly. As we look at the tabernacle, the names that were given were not just random, but they were meant to convey an important point. So you have words like, it was called a dwelling, a tent of meeting, house of the Lord, the dwelling of the testimony, a sanctuary, that is the place of holiness, a holy place. And so without going into detail, some of the things that God was trying to communicate were, as it says on your sheet, He was in their midst on the desert floor. In other words, God didn't say, hey, I'm the high and holy one up here, and I know down there on the desert floor, the winds howl, the sand gets between your toes, 120 degrees is hot no matter what the humidity is, but tough it out. No. God used terms for His dwelling place that were the same terms used for the tent that they lived in. Because He said, I want you to know that I live in your midst. I dwell among you people. I want to be associated with you. He also wanted them to know that this place was the place of His localized presence, the place where He revealed Himself, a place that was separate from the sphere of the profane, etc. And again, I might just remind you, think of the names that churches have today because they're trying to convey something about their church. Victory Baptist, Bethany, Mount Sinai, Holiness Tabernacle, etc. Well, where in the world did they come up with that? It's because they simply, generally said, well, hey, there's this all-important story revolving around this location, so Bethany's not the name of our town, but we're going to just call it Bethany Baptist Church or Mount Sinai Presbyterian Church or whatever. Okay? And so God was also reminding these people the names of the tabernacle communicated theology. And then we have the blueprint itself. 2 key points. First, it was divinely given. In other words, human genius didn't inaugurate it, but God's imperative did. Man didn't think up a really nifty way to approach God and say, hey, I got it, guys. let's say we're going to approach God by doing this, and we'll vote on it, and as long as we get a majority, then God will be pleased with it. I never find a place in the Bible where God asked people what they wanted to do to approach Him, and He could sit down over coffee with them and negotiate and then sign off on it. Never, never. It's always, as I say, worship is from the top down, in the sense God always tells people, here is how you worship me and you enter my presence. And if somebody says, but I don't like it, it's not contemporary in my culture. Dare I say, God's kind, gracious, sweet reply is, tough stuff. You ain't the boss. I'm God and you're not. Yeah. And that's why He was telling these people. He's saying, I will tell you how to build the tabernacle because it has theological meaning, and this is teaching you how you enter my presence and you will be accepted, because that's what worship is all about. B, the blueprint instructions reveal something of the character of the architect, who is God. Again, if you do much reading just in secular sources, newspapers, magazines, whatever, and they talk about an architect who maybe just died, a famous architect, and they'll say he was known in American history as the most famous architect for downtown buildings. And notice in every city where he built a famous building, it's known for its maybe glass, because 80% of the building had glass. Or maybe it's for the geometric design, or maybe it's for, you name it. And they'll say, that's kind of weird, isn't it? Well, that was what that architect liked. It was telling you something about his character, his desires. And so when God built this building, by the things that we see in His building, we begin to realize some of His character traits, if you will. So, for example, He's interested in details and following instructions. And so Exodus emphasizes that everything He told them to do, the people did. And granted, that can get a little boring for us, because God says, build it this way, and then it says they build it that way, and then it says God signed off on it because they build it appropriately. Come on, God, don't waste my time. Just say it one time and we'll take for granted it was... No, God is trying to emphasize to us, this is how you do it, and the people obeyed Him. Okay? So God was very interested in instructions and obedience. God is interested in variety. Think of all the materials that were used, and I've listed some of them there. God is interested in beauty. Think of the materials that were used, the workmanship. Just one piece even, that lampstand that was, about 66 pounds of gold, and it was a one piece that somebody had to make. Think of the priestly regalia. In Exodus 28, it specifically says, craft these garments for the priests for glory and for beauty. So not only did they have to point to things eternal, if you will, but they were just plain old beautiful, as the priests had special garments to wear in ministry. Then we see He's interested, or He's not overly extravagant. There's not a wastefulness of resources. There were no $10,000 toilet seats or $15,000 faucets that we read about with government expenditures or whatever and say, what in the world? No. God was not overly extravagant, but He was not excessively frugal. He didn't say, we could use a cardboard box for that. That'd be good enough. And, no. He made sure it looked nice, if you will, but you wouldn't have walked through there and said, what a waste. And then we see He is also practical, because it needed to be portable so they could take it down, move it. It needed to be sturdy. They needed accessibility of materials. Have you ever thought of that? 2 million plus Israelites out in the Sinai Peninsula, and God says, build me a building so that you will have a place to worship me. Lowe's hadn't started yet. Home Depot wasn't in Egypt. I mean, where in the world are they going to get these supplies out there? And yet God in His goodness provided for them so that they were all available there, or it was stuff that they had brought with Him. So again, this is incredible as we see God directing His people. There was the threefold division. And remember how through this, he was trying to teach them the way of approach to himself. The tabernacle furniture placement, when you entered, you had the altar of burnt offering out in the courtyard, and then you had the laver, and then you go in the holy place where the priest could, and then in the most holy place where only the high priest could go on one day of the year, etc. And so as I put on the sheet the quote, the furniture, like the structure itself, had symbolic value, typifying great theological realities whose full significance could not be understood except in dim outline. So God was trying to teach his people really, really important theological things so that they could rightly worship him. And last but not least, the workers. God gave the people a willing heart to be generous with their contributions. They freely gave offerings, and this is what's so amazing. Moses had to restrain them from giving. The people gave so much. Can you imagine one Sunday if when Pastor Phil or Pastor Andrew gets up for the offering time and the pastoral prayer and says, no, we're going to have pastoral prayer, and usually this is the time of the offering, but people, nobody, we're not going to allow you to give money today. Put that checkbook back in your place. If you contributed online, go back and cancel that because we're not taking any money from you this week. We are so abounding in money, we don't need your green stuff. Can you imagine that? Now, I'm not trying to put a thought in your mind, okay? We do need the green stuff to keep. But the point is, this is incredible, where the people were so generous, not only with their money, but themselves. The way it says they gave themselves, so whatever skill they had. A woman said, hey, I'm really good at crocheting. Hey, Bezaleel, make a note of that. We can use her on some of these priestly garments. Somebody else says, my expertise is metallurgy. Put a tag on him because we've got a lot of stuff we can use him. Well, I can't do that, but I am a good woodworker. Put a tag on him. We've got a lot of woodwork to do around here. And whatever a person could do, they simply were willing to roll up their sleeves and do it, and with the blessing of God, they were able to do what God wanted them to do. So I'm trying to remind us, dear people, that worship is a serious thing to God, and the place of worship does matter. And of course, the manner and the content of worship matters, but that's not what we're emphasizing today. So we should not take this kind of stuff lightly. Now, let's hasten on. If you want to go to page 2 or flip your handout over, and let's begin to bring this home to Kaysville Bible Church. Now, as you see at the very top, Kaysville Bible Church has inhabited 3 buildings in our 50-year history. Okay, and you see the locations for them. 1 was rented, and 2 we built and owned. Now, maybe I should draw a patented map on the chart so you can get some good laughs. Okay, so let's just kind of do it this way, and this is not like your typical map with north at the top. Okay, but we're going to say that north is over here. Okay, and this is Main Street in Kaysville. And right here is that major light there at Main Street in Kaysville. And so coming this way is 2nd North. And as you know, those are the 2, shall we say, main drags in Kaysville, okay? The Main Street is going north and south, and 2nd North is going east and west. Okay, now the first building we had rented, Ron Thompson rented. If you come over here and you go to Center Street, and today you have the city buildings right here on this corner. So here's the light, and so you take a right, go that way, and then you take a left here at where the city buildings are. And right here on that corner is where the first KBC building was, and that is, as you see, 94 East Center Street. So that's where it all began, and you can look at the timeline right below it. Ron and Wanda Thompson arrived in Utah arrived in Kaysville. They'd gotten to Utah a couple months earlier, but they got to Kaysville August the 31st of 72, and then the first KBC service was actually November the 5th of 1972. So when we celebrate this year on November 5th, it's actually about as close to the original date as you can get. 1975, however, as the Lord blessed, they purchased property at 197 West, 100 South. So if you keep going here on Main Street, Actually, of course, you go here, and then the road will curve a little bit. And so right here is where you go down, and right here was 197 west, 100 south. Okay? So that's where KBC was from 1976 to 1995. And of course, at this first building, it was in a residential section. It was really about 2 blocks off of, or 3 blocks from downtown Kaysville. And for those of you who are not old-timers, remember, in those days, Kaysville was only a population of about 18,000 people. All those businesses, as you drive in second north from the interstate, that was just housing, no businesses there. All you had was really these few buildings right along there on Main Street. Okay, so we were in a good location. It's amazing how God had directed Ron to that place. But at that place, the people had a mind to work. And so as the church continued to grow, there needed to be expansion. So you can see that in the spring of 81, we added to that facility a new kitchen, classrooms, and gym. And of course, a lot of that work KBCers did themselves. They were simply people who rolled up their sleeves, had abilities, and they would come in and work in the evenings, Saturdays, etc., to be able to do a lot of that. KBC continued to grow. We needed more room, and so we had that sanctuary expansion in October of 1987, where we knocked out a couple of back walls in the sanctuary and added more pews. So I think that might have added maybe, 40 possibility for 40 more people or so. But as we continued serving the Lord, simply got to the point where, wow, we need to expand more than that. Okay? So as I put on your sheet then, as you drop to the bottom, as you drop below this, what kind of options do we have for what kind of options do we have to expand? Well, the first option was, let's not add any space because we are just one happy family as is, and so if nobody else can come, so what? We enjoy ourselves. And I won't use any names so I don't convict the guilty, but we actually had somebody in church who basically said that in those words. We're having a good time. Why is there a need to expand and have other people come? Secondly, because we said, well, that's not a good option. That wasn't the way to go, okay? Secondly, we could begin to have a second Sunday a.m. service. And I know for some preachers that puts a feather in their hat like, wow, I'm so important, so many people want to hear me, I need to preach twice on Sunday morning. I was the exact opposite, and I said, wait a minute, basically what you end up with is 2 congregations, and the twain shall never meet. They really do not merge together as one people of God in this place. I despise it. Sometimes that might be okay, but that is far, far from being ideal. So C, plan another church in the area. Okay, so when you think of kind of another map, let's just say, here's Kaysville, and then up here you have Fruit Heights, and here you have Layton, and here you have Clearfield, and here you have Farmington, etc. So we literally just took a map and said, okay, where do the people who attend Kaysville Bible Church come from? And so we started putting marks on the map, and everything, and all of a sudden we said, wait a minute. We don't have any distinct area where a whole group of people were coming from. It wasn't like we said, whoa, way over here in, is it Hooper or whatever, or way out there, wow, we've got, 26 people coming from out here, so it's only logical instead of driving 30 minutes, we plant a church here. No. We just didn't have any kind of thing like that. It was just so evenly spaced around there that we said it probably wouldn't be ideal to simply say, well, let's split the KBC congregation up. Because as you know, and again, we're way back in the 80s, early 90s, remember, there are not nearly as many non-Mormon churches in the area, etc., and a lot of smaller churches just really struggle. So why do you want to take a really healthy church and cut off, shall we say, too much of an appendage that actually then you have 2 struggling churches? So, yeah, and Roy Bible Church actually had come out of Kaysville Bible Church much earlier. And Roy was, should we say, far enough away, 12 miles, 14 miles, whatever. So it's not like we didn't have a church planning desire. It was simply that didn't seem to make much sense with what we saw when we grafted. So it was probably about 77, maybe 78, because we got here in November of 80. So yeah, it's late 70s. And so D, another possibility was to add on to our current building, because that seemed like the most feasible option. We had enough property where we were. Financially, it wouldn't be nearly as costly, etc. So we began to plan on that, had plans drawn up, etc. Although we did find out that, wow, everything in that original building was going to have to be brought up to the current code at that time in the mid-90s, which meant fire built into the ceiling and so forth in the entire facility. It meant we were going to have huge handicap ramps, because the only way to get up to the sanctuary was about 12, 14 steps or so. And so, we're talking major stuff. But we had plans drawn up, and we had a price on it. The congregation approved it. And so we met with the contractor in the old KBC gym one day. He laid it all out, said, here it is. You 5 board members, whatever, sign on the dotted line. And we said, wait a minute. That's about $75,000 more than we were told it was going to be. And so we don't really know that we want to do that. And so as I remember it, as I was there, the contractor just started knocking off things like, well, we could delete this and it would save you $2,400, and we could cut this and it would save you another $3,000. And I think, if I remember correctly, he knocked off about $30,000 or so that day. But we looked at it and said, wait a minute, is it still worth what we would invest in that building with all that stuff we would have to do, or would it be smart if maybe we would think of another alternative and get another building? And so we didn't sign the papers, and so as I put on your sheet there, under D, God spared us. I always look back to that and I say, wow, God saved us from ourselves. We were trying to do what was right, and there would have been nothing wrong with adding on. But in the long run, when you look at it and think we would have put in that amount of money to stay in that location and then just have an upgraded facility, if you will, wow, God was mighty good to us to slam that door, even though at the moment it was like, whoa, what's going on here? So we came to our final option, number E on your sheet, and that was we need to find property and build. But 2 small challenges. Number 1, what were we going to do with our white elephant church? And it wasn't white if you've ever driven past it, okay? It was yellow. But a white elephant, as you know, is basically something you can't get rid of, so you just give it to somebody. And in Utah, a Protestant church, a non-Mormon church, the only non-Mormon church in Kaysville, what kind of value does that have? Who's just breaking down the door saying, yes, I want to buy it yesterday? So that was going to be a problem. And number 2, the second challenge is, where would we find land for a reasonable price? And then, if we did find it, how could we afford the new building? We had a couple $100,000 in savings. We'd always been people had been generous, frugal, etc. But we're talking about a big project here. Well, the Lord was mighty good to us. So Lauren Madsen, you've heard his name come up before, but he'd been saved out of Mormonism later in life. He had a lot of skills, had a passionate desire for God and the things of God, and he knew a lot of things in the area because he'd lived here. And so he and I began to go out on a real estate hunt, okay? And so if you kept going down Main Street, just up the street from here, on this side of the road, the right side of the road, Big Davis High School is right over here. There was a nice big lot, and it's like, whoa, that's pretty close to ours, Main Street, Kaysville. That'd be great. Talked to the people. They found out it was going to be a Bible church. No, it's not for sale. Wouldn't sell it to you. Okay, and that's a tune we heard a good bit. So then and I'm not sure how this came about. We went this way, and somehow he had talked to some city people. And as you know, right over here is Bowman's Market. Okay, still Bowman's today. And the city owned some property right behind it. Okay, just a block or so off of Main Street. And somehow they were thinking they would be willing to even swap properties. They'd give us that and they would take ours. And I forget how they were going to use ours, but those negotiations never went very far at all. So, okay, that's not going to work. Well then, another thing that I put on your sheet was that at least one family looked at our building, believe it or not, and they said, well, they would renovate it as a house, and the gym area, as big as it was, they would put a nice indoor pool in there. Man, that would have been nice, okay? But as I remember, after they came and looked at it, they never got back with us. Probably figured they couldn't afford it, or, well, that's kind of ridiculous to do that renovation. So we decided, okay, let's look way outside of Kaysville, out in the boondocks. You have to remember now, this is mid-1990s, and so you have I-15 running here, and you have the railroad tracks running here. In those days, it wasn't an overpass, and so when you came out this way, you could easily get stopped by the train, as Phil and Francis Bach, I shouldn't call names, should I? Realized many times when they were late for church or came in huffing and puffing saying, well, the train stopped us, we couldn't get here. Okay? And also out here, all of this was farmland. Okay? I mean, there were buffalo roaming, there were Indians attacking the forts at night. I mean, this was virgin territory, everything this side of I-15. No Barnes Park, I mean nothing, literally nothing but a few houses and big farms and cattle, okay? And so when we say, who is going to come out here a mile in the boondocks to worship? Are we just kind of putting ourselves in a terrible place and going to spend all that money to build a new building? But we decided, well, let's pursue it. And right here on this side, which was right over this way, there were a couple of acres, and a lady living in a house right here. We knocked on her door and said, hey, we're Lauren and Royce, Kaysville Bible Church. We'd like to buy this if we could. What are you going to buy it for? Well, we're going to build a church. And she seemed, as I remember, interested that she would have been willing to sell it, but she said either she had already donated it to or sold it to the LDS church. So she said, I can't sell it to you, because it really isn't owned by me anymore. And so, and by the way, quick interjection here, I like to say we forced the Mormon church to build there, because as soon as we put the shovel in the ground here, guess what happened? They put a shovel in the ground there, and they dedicated their building like 2 weeks before we did. Where in the history of Mormonism have they built a church a mile out in the boondocks when there are no people around it? You don't find them doing that. They always build it where there's subdivisions and people, etc. But as soon as we bought this, they got their name. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Out here, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Flint. Okay, Flint is right here. Excuse me. Yeah, Flint is out here, so it was the corner here. And a man named Jay Green owned this property right here, and somehow Lauren had contact with him, knew him. And so we talked to Jay Green, and he said, yeah, he would sell us as many acres as we wanted here. I think there's like 4.5, 5 acres here, but basically we could only afford 2 acres at a little over $41,000 a piece, because that was $82,000 chunk of change just to buy the land. And so we ended up buying these two acres that we have right here. So again, it is amazing now when you look at what this area is like, the way Kaysville grew out this way with industry, with the park, with all the housing, and with the huge mall area. I mean, you talk about a valuable piece of real estate we're sitting on, but it's all because of the way the Lord directed and the way He slammed all these other doors for us, saying, no, I'm not going to let you there. I'm going to protect you from yourself. So what a matchless way God was at work. But now we need blueprints and we need a contractor. And the Lord had brought along our way a firm, Dan Cook and Associates, out of Ogden. He was a developer and a builder who'd only recently been saved in those days. And he had a real passion to help churches be able to afford buildings as well as Christian school. There in the 90s, he was really passionate about the Christian school movement. And so he would help organizations, or he would help local groups of people be able to build buildings, get a Christian school off the ground, etc. So he had drawn so many blueprints for churches. He had a lot of good ideas. And so again, it was of the Lord, the kinds of things he told us. He reminded us we want a nice big open area when people enter so they're not just rubbing against shoulders. Although maybe now you say, wait a minute, we have so many people. He reminded us the importance of the nursery, that if you don't have a good big nursery, people are going to be turned off. Maybe not by the preaching, whatever, but they're going to say, I don't know that you can care for my kid okay. He also, I think as I remember, worked with us to say you probably don't want the old boxy type of church, where it's just, about a quarter of a mile long and the pastor is standing up here and you're back here and he can't see you and you can't see him, but you're glad that he can't see you. But it's just so far down, the alley, if you will. It was, no, don't you want a sanctuary where the people feel like they're right part of it? So he gave us a lot of good, helpful advice. Of course, we had multiple congregational polls asking people what they would like to see in a church. Not guaranteed you're going to get what you want, but what sounds feasible? What do you think is good? We had a lot of meetings, and our philosophy was, of course, this is a place for worship. It's not primarily a social center or anything of the sort. It's for worship. It's for the educating of the people of God. And part of those two components is also the fellowship aspect, where God's people can come together as well in fellowship. And so our whole point was that we're going to build, since this is a limited territory, we're going to build, and basically we're going to build for X number of people, and if we ever fill this facility out, then what we're going to have to do is not knock out a wall and expand, because we didn't build it that way, and we don't have the property to do it, at least not now. But we would then plant another church somewhere locally. So that was our whole thing about space communicating. We were not just building to try and build the biggest mega church this side of Houston or anything of the sort. We said, no, this is our philosophy of ministry. This is what we're trying to communicate. And so the Lord greatly blessed. Now, originally, we planned to have a partial basement, and in fact, I forgot to bring the drawing. There's a drawing here in our sound room. I should have brought on a piece of cardboard to show you one of the original plans where there was going to be a basement under the educational wing over here. Well, then, as we talked about it, looked at it, checked into it, you would have had to have made it handicap accessible, plus you would have needed an elevator to make it handicap accessible. And all of a sudden, you were talking, I think in those days, that was like an additional $30,000 just to get an elevator installed. So it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Well, again, the Lord was in all this, because when they came in and started to begin to do the groundwork, they found the water table is so high, they actually had to bring in more soil to build up right here where this whole cement slab is. So there would have been no way in the world that we would have wanted to build a basement anyhow. I mean, we'd have had a sump pump running year-round there or whatever. Or maybe we could have had a water slide permanently for the children or something. I don't know. But again, the Lord was just marvelous in the way He was directing through all of these things. Well, also, just a reminder, Kaysville City was known for their persnicketiness about codes. They were either the number one, the worst place in the state of Utah to build, or the second worst place. That wasn't by our estimation. That was what the statistics or other people said. So, I mean, they were super persnickety about everything when it came to the building. And so there were times when we maybe wanted to tweak something a little bit. And you know what their common response was? Well, this is the way the church does it, so this is the way you will do it. And you know what they mean by this is the way the church does it. And so there are multiple things that were built into this building because it was, shall we say, Mormon church code. It's not that we were trying to build an unsafe building that people should fear for their life if they came. It was simply that's one of the ways that they could really cut back on things. And literally, they actually told us, if you don't like it, that's fine. We don't want you here anyhow, so you don't need to build. Okay, but that didn't stop our people. Thankfully, we just said, hey, we're gonna keep working, and God intervened. Now, the next thing then let's move to is, well, what about this white elephant? Okay? Well, again, the Lord was in control of all this because I forget how we got in touch with True Vine Baptist Church in Layton. They're an African-American congregation, and they were outgrowing their facility, and but they couldn't get a loan from a bank to go out and build or buy another facility. And so we talked to them, etc., and we said, okay, we've got an idea. We will sell you our building, and we, Kaysville Bible Church, will be your bank. So in other words, you will make your payments to us every month, just like you would go to another bank. We'll hold the loan for you. But, now remember this, whenever you sell something like that and move, it can be a real pain because you get kicked out of that building, and now what do you need to do? Where's a gym we can rent? Where's a facility to rent? Where would my office be? All kinds of stuff. So we said, okay, we'll tell you what. If we are good to you and act as your bank, you allow us to stay in that building and share it with you for as long as it takes for us to get our building built. And they said, okay. So for 9-10 months or so in 1995, True Vine Baptist Church, the African American Assembly in Kaysville, met in that building, and Kaysville Bible Church met in that building. We said, we'll give you first dibs. When would you like to worship on Sunday? They chose the morning hours. We said, okay, so we'll come in at like 1 in the afternoon until 6, and we will have our Sunday school, our AM service. We'll take a little break and have our PM service and prayer time, all at that time, and then we're out of the building so you can have it at Sunday night if you want it. When it came to our Awana stuff, we said we would prefer these nights for our Awana program. They said, okay, we would prefer these nights for our programs. And so we shared the building. My office stayed right there, so I was able to keep that through the whole thing. And again, God just marvelously intervened, so it was a perfect relationship the way it worked out until we were able to move into this building then in late 1995. And by the way, on Saturday, November the 5th, when we're having our celebration here, they have generously agreed that afternoon from 2:30 to 4 p.m. we can go back to this building and walk through it to reminisce concerning our roots. Okay? So maybe you want to go back and say, yes, I remember standing here in the gym holding a cup of coffee the first time I ever met Royce, and I was so impressed with him, that's why I'm still here today drinking coffee with him. Or, whatever the reason, but kind of like when you go back to your hometown and you see that house where you were raised and you say, wow, I wish people would let me go back in that house and just see, where I played, where my toy room was, etc., etc. So for an hour and a half on that Saturday, they've said, yes, we can go back, we can tour the facility, etc. So another problem, however, is money, as always. So how in the world are we going to finance a new building? It's going to cost just short of $1 million, and that means without the educational wing completely functioning, that means with the kitchen not even complete, and a lot of upgrades have been made to the gym. So, the gym was there and you could use it, but it wasn't nearly as nice as it is now. Well, again, bring God to the center, because we had $625,000 that we needed to come up with. And so there was, again, I forget exactly how we found out about it, but there was a Christian funding corporation in the Midwest that sold bonds or had you sell bonds to your people. And so they would do everything but basically sell the bonds. And so we took on a 15-year project, as you see there, and people could buy bonds so that your bond might come due in 6 months, might come due in a year, it might come due in 18 months, 24 months, all the way up to 15 years. And as I remember, the top rate, and again, this sounds outrageous today, because this was 95, the top rate was something like 7 or 7.5%. So if you bought a 15-year bond, you were being paid 7% interest for those 15 years, and it was cumulative. It was constantly multiplying. Okay? So it was not a bad investment at all. Okay? Was not a bad investment at all. And so as it says there, our people bought bonds. There were other people, just family and friends of KBC who were in other parts of the state as well as out of the state bought bonds. And the Lord just marvelously blessed. Well, a really interesting thing is that we didn't have super wealthy people in our church in the sense that somebody just said, oh yeah, I'll just give you $250,000 and buy $250,000 worth of bonds. No, we're just talking about simple folks like us who simply said, what I have, I'm willing to invest in that. I think it's a good investment. I'm really investing in myself and the work of the Lord in this area. And a couple of really interesting things, again, above and beyond what you could have imagined. Merrill Lynch, if you had an IRA with Merrill Lynch, they said, we will take your IRA funds and buy Kaysville Bible Church bonds with it if you want us to. Now, that's unheard of for a major financial institution in those days to be willing to do that. But the second really amazing thing, Barnes Bank, which is no longer, I guess they're in Kaysville, just about right here. It's gone. But in those days, that was the major bank, LDS owned or Mormon owned, Mormon people owned. And we had done all our business with them through the years. So they told me, after you've sold bonds, and we had about a week or two window opening to sell bonds, they said, whatever bonds you don't sell to your people, we will purchase. At the end of that period, I went in and I said, okay. And they said, okay, we'll buy $125,000 worth of bonds in Kaysville Bible Church. That's incredible. The LDS-owned bank said, we will own part of your church. We will give you that money. We trust you that you will pay it back. And so, the Lord just marvelously worked. 1995 was basically devoted to the construction. Many people labored in many ways, even though basically the whole project was a major construction firm was doing it. Maybe I should backtrack one quick second here. We'll take a few extra minutes this morning to finish this. But Dan Cook's way of doing a building was he had construction managers who would manage your contract. But normally when you get a contractor, he will give you a bid, and let's just say he will say, okay, it's going to be $1 million, and then he goes out and he subcontracts to his cronies, who are the sheetrock guys and the plumbing guys and all that. Well, Dan Cook's way of doing it was he would have his man on site, but he would go out, or we would go out to all these different contractors, so plumbing, heating, whatever it was, and we would get the bids, and we could choose whichever one of these we wanted to get a lower price, because maybe this guy for his plumbing said, well, my plumbing would be $95,000. And that was outrageous, but this contractor always used him, so yeah, I'll hire him and pay him $95,000 because we're buddies and I'm going to make money and he's going to make money. Maybe in reality, the plumbing should have been $68,000 for an equally good job. And so according to Dan Cook's system, we could choose that guy and his man would oversee it all. And so when you go through all these different things that you need to build, you can literally save thousands, tens of thousands, maybe $100,000 or more dollars. And the Lord blessed us with that, and bring in Lauren Madsen again, because he knew building, he built his own houses, etc., etc. He basically was our second KBC, he was a KBC man on the job. Almost daily, he would drop by to make sure they were doing it right and let this guy know, wait a minute, you didn't do that right. They need to change this.
Dan's company is called Building God's Way.
Today it's called Building God's Way?
Back then it was called Building God's Way.
Oh, okay.
That's the name of the entire company.
The entire company, okay. Yeah. So that was a real godsend, that the way that he worked things, and that helped us, as I say, to save money. And then some of the things that we could do ourselves, especially out in the yard work, etc., we were able to do as the people just pulled together. And of course, at that time as well, as people pulled together, Susan Learman, who's still part of our congregation, a professional interior designer, she was able to say, well, hey, here is what you should do to make this look nice, etc. And she not only had contractors, but a lot of those contractors actually donated things because they could use a tax break, and so she did so much business with them that they literally gave us things to help in the interior decorating. So it is just amazing. It is just amazing how the Lord was at work. So one last thing then on your sheet, the workers, God blessed us with unity, generosity. Although the first phase of the work was contracted out, there was ample opportunity for everybody to do what they could do to finish the job, and indeed God provided. 4 quick points of application as we think of, okay, so what about us? What does this mean for us so it's not just history? Number 1, God's hand and fingerprints. I hope often enough in this lesson today I said, and look at how God did this, and look at what God did there, because it really was a matter of God's involvement in everything. Just like when you read the book of Esther, the name God never appears in the book of Esther. But God is at center stage, if you will, on all the things that just so happen. Well, that's the way it really was with us. God never signed off our title on this property. God never signed off on the blueprints. But God was involved in every single thing that was transpiring, either keeping us from stumbling over our own feet or making it possible for us to get what we needed. Secondly, faith and trust. As we grew and prospered, we believed God was in it and responsible for the growth. So we trusted Him to sell the white elephant. We trusted Him to help us find the right property. It was just a matter of banking on God through it all. God gave us unity. When you think of the 200 people that we had attending in those days, how much strife and faction there could have been, where people would have just said, well, if I don't get my way, I'm going to go to another church. No, they didn't. They said, okay, I would prefer this, but for the overall ministry, I realize that's something I can do in my home. We really don't need an ice cream machine here. I was the one that said we should do it. No. Well, we really don't need that here. That wouldn't be the most important thing for the people of God. So everybody just pulled together. And finally, perseverance. There were multiple setbacks, closed doors, changes, delays, you name it. But the people kept going forward. We simply trusted this was what God wanted. And by the way, my last point is, when we started this building project, we were averaging over 200 people every Sunday morning at Kaysville Bible Church. And by the time we entered here, we had lost about 40 regular attenders. Not because they were upset or they went to another church. It seemed like just about every Sunday, a different man came to me and said, you know what, Royce? My boss told me on Friday, I've got a month to decide, do I want to move to Omaha and keep my job, or do I want to stay here and be unemployed? So what do I do? So you try and give them counsel. A week or two later, another man comes to me, you know what, Royce, you're not going to believe this, but my job just lost a government contract, and so I'm one of the odd men out. I either have to get another job or just move elsewhere. What am I going to do? And we lost about 40 to 50 regular attenders during that time. That was enough to get cold feet and say, did we blow it? Should have we not entered on this program? But you know what? On the day when we dedicated this, by the time we moved in, God had replaced almost every one of those with other families. Again, it was all of God. Nothing that we could have done. Phil? And we paid off the bonds in, I think, 12 and a half years. We didn't even take the full 15 years to do it as the Lord blessed. So, sorry for that extra time, 5-6 minutes there, but that gives you a little bit of an idea of how God has been so good to us, and hopefully we can go forward with His blessing on us. Okay, you're dismissed.